I've got a special guest on the show today who talks about how he uses musical parameters in his jazz practice sessions to really level them up, to really hone in on certain elements to get the very most out of them. We're going to talk all about that and more, but first let's cue the music.
Welcome to the LJS podcast, where you get weekly jazz tips, interviews, stories, and advice for becoming a better jazz musician. And now your host. He's a jazz musician, author, and entrepreneur, Brent Vaartstra.
What's up, everybody? It is Brent, the jazz musician behind the website LearnJazzStandards.com, which is a blog, a podcast, and videos all geared towards helping you become a better jazz musician. I want to thank you so much for listening today. Whether this is your very first time or if you are a regular listener, I do appreciate it. I don't take it for granted. And because of that, I have lined up a really great special show for you with a special guest, Josiah Boornazian. He's a saxophonist, composer, a teacher, really a brilliant musician. He also is a regular writer on the LJS blog, does a lot of theory posts, just really brilliant musical mind. And he's been on the show, but he hasn't been on in a very long time. So very excited to get him on the show today, where we're going to be talking about a lot of things, some general tips. He really lays down the goods today. You're definitely not going to want to miss this one, but we do hone in especially on the topic of using parameters in your practice sessions. We go over 3 different kinds of parameters that you can use to really hone in on material and really get the very most out of it. You'll learn all about that in 1 second, so I don't want to spoil anything, but that is the topic for today. Really excited about this. Josiah just always enlightens me. I learn a lot from talking to him and just learning from him and hearing him play. I mean, everything about who he is as a musician is really inspiring. So I know that he will also inspire you too. That is why I have guests on the show. That is why I keep doing this, to inspire, to educate. Josiah also talks about a book that he's come out with recently. It's a jazz improvisation and theory book. You're not going to want to miss that one either. He talks more about that at the end, but make sure you visit his website. It's josiahboornazian.com. It's a tough one, so I'll spell it for you. It's JosiahBoornazian.com. Check him out there. Hey, we got a lot to talk about, so without further ado, let's jump in to today's show. All right, welcoming on the show today is saxophonist, composer, arranger, educator, Josiah Boornazian. Hey, Josiah, it's been a while since we had you on, so man, I'm excited to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a minute. It's a pleasure to be back.
So you've been on several episodes, but some of them were really early on. Maybe not everybody knows who you are, and I definitely want people to know. In fact, if they don't know who you are, man, that's how do people not know who you are, right? You're like, well, I guess they don't. So let's hear the story. Like, who are you? What do you do? What keeps you busy?
Well, like you said, I'm a saxophonist, but you know, like most of us, I wear many different hats. I'm also an electronic musician. I make electronic music, and I perform and record mixing my jazz and live saxophone playing with effects pedals and digitally sequenced music. I teach part-time at the University of Miami right now. I'm finishing up my doctorate there. It's a Doctor of Musical Arts degree in Jazz Studies. And I also compose, do a bit of freelance teaching, and also trying to be a jazz musician, you know, so making records with my friends and touring a little bit. Was touring Europe last year. I'm in New York at least 4 or 5 times a year, and playing a lot locally here in Miami. So I'm a little bit all over the place, but that's the world we live in. You have to be diverse if you want to make a living doing this music. So.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And so when I think about you, I think about someone who is just insanely musical. I think when I first met you, it was at a jam session in New York, and we were both going to the same college. Except for that, you know, we're the same age, but you were like you were like student teaching already. You were doing your master's degree or something, So, I mean, you're just always someone who's been, in my opinion, ahead of the curve. I mean, you're an incredible composer. You're an incredible educator. So it's always been great to have you on. And what was it, about a year and a half ago, when I started shifting a lot of my efforts towards the podcast and now making videos, I started having you on for the blog, at which you create a lot of amazing monthly content for the Learn Jazz Standards blog. So, man, I appreciate you doing that. And I think everybody who's listening should definitely be checking out his stuff, because you just lay down some awesome stuff over there.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be able to share my thoughts and my insights with the community. We have a great community here at Learn Jazz Standards, and the feedback I get is just wonderful. And I have people who I correspond with sometimes, so it's a real treat and very rewarding for me. And I'm very grateful and fulfilled that people are getting some value out of the insights and thoughts that I share.
That's awesome. And so you obviously you are a jazz trained musician. You do electronic music. You do all kinds of stuff like you were just talking about. Now, as far as let's talk for a second a little bit, because I think the audience is always interested in just hearing from successful musicians and, kind of like how they started to really take things up to the next level. Like, what were some things that you started doing or you started working on in the practice room, before all of this happened? Like maybe when you were just getting started, what were some things that you found were really helped you level up your skills?
Well, very early on, so we're talking in high school for me. I'm from California originally. I grew up there, and I started playing around the age of 11. And I was really lucky that I got to start working professionally when I was 12. My stepdad played in a little local community jazz band, and he went back to school to get his doctorate and couldn't play in the band anymore, so I took his spot. So number one is experience. I'm going to talk a lot about practicing in a second. And before I talk about practicing, those early experiences of before I hit the shed for 4 to 6 hours a day for a number of years, I was always connected to the actual performing side of music, getting out in front of live audiences and making music with real people in front of other real people. There's invaluable lessons that you learn from that type of experience, and you just can't replicate that in the practice room. But that being said, in late middle school, after I started playing in this big band, that's when I started to get a little more serious. So I took some private lessons, which I absolutely highly recommend for everybody. You need to get not just one, but multiple good private teachers over the course of your life as a musician. The more different perspectives on the music you can get, the better, because everybody has a different personality, a different learning style, and different interests and tastes when it comes to music. And so, you might find one teacher, you click and connect with a lot of what they have to say, but maybe not everything. So you want to diversify. So after getting a private teacher, then I learned that, practicing is really, really important. So especially starting around high school, I started spending, when I'd come home from school, at least 2 to 4 hours a day practicing. And I really started with the most foundational things, which nobody can skip, I think. And that's number one, working on your sound, whatever your instrument is. Working on developing really good sound, even, guitar and piano and drums, which we don't tend to think of as being, instruments that need to spend as much time on their sound. You really should spend time thinking about your sound and your touch as you're practicing your foundational technical exercises. So I spend a lot of time, even today, working on my sound. As a saxophone player, it's the first thing that people hear about you when you play, the first thing they notice, and it's one of the most important things. If you don't have a good sound to begin with, it doesn't matter how wonderful your ideas are or how hip your ideas are. You're going to lose the audience. So I spent a lot of time with sound and a lot of time on scales early on for me. And I have to say that was huge, because I used to just spend hours and hours and hours practicing scales and scale patterns. And so I never had particularly good ears naturally. But when I got to college, I managed to excel in my ear training classes. I'm convinced because I had so much experience playing scales and scale patterns. When you practice scales and intervals, you just hear intervals through sheer repetition. And when you practice scales, you hear scales through sheer repetition. And I think that gave me a leg up on my competition for my ear training, which was important because, like I said, I don't have a naturally gifted ear. I've had to work very hard at training my ear. So working on your sound, working on scales, and then I really dug in college. And again, I had at least a couple of years where I was practicing at least 2 to 4 hours a day, if not 4 to 6 hours a day. And that's on top of, the playing I was doing in ensembles, at jam sessions, and performing around town. So that was an important period. And, the same kind of things, working on foundational things, still working a lot on my sound, and just really starting to focus on working on my time and on sharpening my harmony knowledge so I could get better at keeping track of forms and when I'm soloing over forms and really come up with a better method of learning tunes so that they stick with me forever. And I still rely on that practicing that I did those first 2 or 3 years in college. Every day I rely on that practicing that I did. So
awesome. So LJS community, let's review a little bit about what Josiah said. He just said a lot of valuable stuff. Let's unpack that just a little bit. We need to be getting experience, right? Because at the end of the day, we can be sitting in the practice room all day long, but if you're not going out there and getting some real world application, going to those jam sessions, going out and trying to get a gig with some people, without that, our jazz education is incomplete. So we need to be doing that. Now, Josiah, there's a lot of people in the audience, I'm going to put you on the spot here, but there's a lot of people in the audience who don't live in maybe metropolitan areas that have more playing experience. Could you give any advice for people that are not feeling like they have a lot of people to interact with and play with?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would do is I would see if there's any community resources that you can reach out to try and connect with other musicians. So like I said, growing up for me, I grew up in a very, very small town in the Mojave Desert with only one high school in the town. And yet even in that small town, we had, a professional Dixieland band, a professional big band. So I was connected through my stepdad, who is a musician, as I mentioned, got connected to playing with those community bands. So number one, do a Google search of your area, go to any local schools, high schools, colleges, find out if there are musicians, young or old, and connect with them and try and create opportunities. If there aren't opportunities that are walking through your door, you have to walk out the door and create some opportunities. And so those are good places to start. Schools, internet search, because it's really important, like you said, to just connect with some people. And even if it's as simple to start out with as just getting, 2 or 3 other people together who are like-minded and meeting up at someone's house with whatever instrumentation you have and making music together, even if you need to use a backing track, if you don't have a drummer or you don't have a bassist or you don't have a chord instrument, you have to get a little creative, but it will absolutely pay off.
Absolutely. And you talked about having teachers, and not just one teacher, but having multiple different teachers with different perspectives. Listen, we all need guidance. We all need that perspective. We need, we need some hand-holding sometimes. And so that's so important. You also talked about you talk about your sound and stuff like that. That's really important. That's true that I feel like as a guitar player, I don't necessarily always think about my sound. And no, I'm not talking about the pedals you buy or all that stuff, but that stuff is all important, plays a big part. Now, I really loved what you said about working on those scales. I call it technique. I kind of put all that around, and that's what I call, and those who've been listening for the last month or so know that I call the big 3, and technique is the very first one, because if we don't have that technique, it can be hard to do everything else that improvisation requires. But you said something that I've never thought about before, or never even said before, which is that it helped you train your ears. And even just doing that stuff set you up for success. So it's cool to hear all your stuff that you just said, kind of the behind the scenes, the before it all started almost of the very foundational elements that have set you up to be such a great player. So thanks so much for sharing all that. That's incredibly valuable. Take notes, folks, if you aren't already. All right, so let's move on a little bit. We've talked about practicing. You said you spent a lot of time in the practice session, practicing, having practice sessions. What would you say, how long should people be practicing? What's necessary? What's not necessary?
It's a tough question because your amount of practicing is really dependent on a number of factors. The most important one being your ability level. So, if you're John Coltrane, the great irony is that he used to practice, sometimes 8 to 12 hours a day when he was already at the level where he probably didn't need to practice that much. And everybody's personality is a little bit different. So some people, when they get to that extreme level of technical ability, the more they practice can actually hinder their musical growth, because then they become so focused on themselves and technique that they're not sharpening the more creative and communicative side of their playing. But for the vast majority of us who are not at that level, myself included, we need to put in the hours. Bottom line, if you're serious about growing, if you're serious about getting together a good mastery of your instrument and of this music, it's going to require a minimum number of hours of practicing. And Malcolm Gladwell and some other scholars have thrown out the 10,000 hour number, which is, I think, it's a pretty decent rule of thumb. So I kind of use that as a guideline, and I say, hey, look, if you're going to put together a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, you got to look at what's realistic for your lifestyle. But if possible, I'd make 2 hours a day your sort of your benchmark. If you skip a day, if you even skip a week, it's not the end of the world. If most days you're at 90 minutes, but a couple days you're at 3 hours, you don't need to drive yourself crazy with being militaristic about tracking every minute. But the important thing is to get the time in. So I think that 2 hours a day is a good shooting target. And the thing is, it also doesn't have to be continuous. So, a lot of us are busy, and you might have a family, a day job, so on and so forth, other hobbies. So sometimes it's hard to carve out 2 hours solid. And actually, there's some research that it's actually better to break up your practice session. There was a really interesting study recently about classical musicians where they all practiced the same amount, and some people did it in one big block, and other people broke it up into like 45 minutes to an hour and a half at night before they went to bed, and then 45 minutes to an hour and a half like right when they got up the next morning. And that group had the best results by far. So there's something about, like a little bit of, you work on something kind of in the evening or at night, then you let it go, you sleep on it, and then in the morning you hit it again, and it just is great for your brain and for mastery. So in addition to the time, it's really important to say that yes, you have to put in the hours, but it's not just all about quantity, it's about quality as well. And so I would say that in addition to getting those minimum 10,000 hours in over the course of a few years, really focus on, as I know you are a big advocate of, goal-oriented practicing. Have very concrete goals where you break up your practice session into very clear categories, where you say, I'm going to do 30 minutes of this long tone exercise, and my goal is to be able to play, every note on my instrument, from piano to forte in tune with a tuner. Or I'm going to spend 30 minutes working on this tune, and by the end of the session, I want to be able to walk a bass line, I want to be able to play the tune in 3 different keys, and I want to be able to play the melody, and know all the changes, and so on and so forth. The listeners get the idea. The point is to have some very concrete goals in how you carve up the time, so that you don't end up just spending 2 hours kind of noodling, playing through things that you're already good at. We want to find that balance where we're challenging ourselves with things that we know we need to work on, and make sure we're setting clear targets so that we're working toward that and not just wasting time.
Awesome. Love it. So great. So we get we need to be working on these things. This is how long we should be working if we're really trying to amp up those skills, level up pretty quickly here. So great information here. So let's talk a little bit. We've talked a lot about practicing on this podcast over the last couple of months here. Let's hone in a little deeper on this kind of stuff. And I know you want to talk about parameters today in our practicing. So tell me, when we're talking about setting parameters within our practice sessions, tell me what you mean by that, and maybe let's expand a little bit. I know that you have 3 categories you want to work out of here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, by parameters, I mean giving yourself clear guidelines or restrictions about what you're doing while you're practicing so that you can focus on one specific area of music making. So, music has many, many, many elements, dynamics, how loud or soft we're playing, timbre, the quality of the sound we're producing, form, the overall structure of the music we're making, and then the big 3 that most people think about: melody, harmony, rhythm, right? We have all of these elements of music like these, and they all interact with each other in complex ways. And so if you want to improve your playing in any one of these areas, or in all of them, sometimes it's really useful to sort of ignore some aspects and really focus on one, and go even deeper and give yourself very clear restrictions so that you are forcing yourself to kind of get creative. Some people use the metaphor of the sandbox, where you create a little box for yourself, and you can't go outside of the box, but you can do whatever you want, build any type of sandcastle you want within the box. I found that that's been really, really helpful for me in both sharpening my fundamental skills, but also teaching me how to develop a set of vocabulary, a set of strategies for improvising that I consider to be highly creative and unique and individualistic, because instead of just memorizing pieces of vocabulary and then reciting them, I'm more focused on picking one aspect of music that I want to emphasize and then getting creative with that. So, and I can give some concrete examples if you want to make that a little more clear.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So parameters, they're helpful because, and tell me if I'm getting this right, they're hyper focusing on an aspect of your musicianship. Maybe sometimes you wouldn't necessarily improvise that way, the way that you're practicing in this moment, but what you're doing is just hyper amping up a certain element, whether it's rhythm or whatever it is, to really try to get that under your fingers, into your subconscious, so that when it does come to the point where we're able to perform and jam and improvise, that those skills become easier. Do I got that right?
Absolutely. And I would go even one step further and say that the sort of parameter setting games that I play with myself can also become motivating ideas for an improvisation, for a solo. To give a concrete example, so let's say I'm going to practice on rhythm. I want to focus on rhythm. So let's say for 20 or 30 minutes, I'll put on a timer, I'll pull up a play along of a tune that I'm working on, and I'll give myself a very strict parameter. So one of them might be, for example, I'm only going to start and end every phrase on an upbeat. So I'm forcing myself to get off of downbeats. So I can start a phrase on the end of 1, end of 2, end of 3, end of 4, and I have to also end it on the end of 1, end of 2, end of 3, end of 4. Already, now I can't rely on scales and patterns and licks, because I just can't, because those kind of things immediately go out the window once you do a paradigm shift and you start thinking in terms of parameters this way. So let's say that's my parameter exercise. I could think of it as an exercise, and I can practice that way. Or, after I start to develop that skill, well, now, that's another trick in my bag of tricks, so to speak, that I can pull out on the bandstand when I'm actually improvising. If I want to inject more syncopation, more excitement, more rhythmic variety, more of a rhythmic intensity and focus and drive into my solo, I can fall back on this idea, this concept of only playing on upbeats. And it's those simple little paradigm shifts that come from forcing yourself to look at restricted parameters that can sometimes transform your playing, transform your approach to improvisation, and in the heat of battle, in the heat of the moment, when you're improvising a solo and you feel like it needs something to shift it in a different direction, you can pull out some of these strategies as well. So I view them not just as tools for the practice room, but also as tools for practical application when you're making music.
Okay, so category 1, rhythm, that's a parameter we can work out of, right? You could use the example you just gave. Could you possibly play an example of that just so we can kind of get a better idea?
Sure. I mean, I'll play how about I'll do maybe the first 4 or 8 bars or so of Stella by Starlight. It might sound a little weird because you don't have a rhythm section to give you.
Oh, right. There's no metronome going. Right.
But I can still kind of give you the idea. I'll count myself in. So
yeah.
So I'm going to try and do 4 or 8 bars of so, and I'm only going to start every little melodic phrase on upbeats, and I'm going to also try and end on upbeats. So I'm never landing on a downbeat.
Well, the good news before you start is that even if you mess up, no one can tell you that you did because they don't even know what they can't prove what time you've been playing in.
Yeah, I could just play on downbeats the whole time. No, I'll try that. I'll count myself in and try and keep myself honest. All right,
awesome.
Here we go.
Go for it.
Stella. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. I cheated at the end. I hit a downbeat. I wasn't. I was like, so already. Yeah. I'm just getting off. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and playing on the ands of the beats, so to speak, and it just automatically gives you a little more swing emphasis, gives you a little more lift in the playing, and it forces you to think. Almost by definition, it forces you to think a little bit more motivically, as opposed to thinking about lines.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love that. When I was listening to you do it, I was like, ooh, I probably would have biffed it before you did. But I was listening to that and I was like, man, that's excellent I was actually thinking literally about creating motivic ideas, because you can take the same phrase but transpose that over a different chord, and that's actually would be a really good way to, even if you're not a great improviser, maybe that would be a great place to start to, even, is just create a small little phrase that ended on the and of 3 or 4, and then just kind of try to figure out a way to repeat that over the different chords going through. Maybe that would be an idea. Yeah, I
can show you that. So, and that's a really good point. What you're getting at is also the great thing about this kind of stuff is that you can dial the parameters to be more specific or less specific. So that one I would say is kind of medium, right? Only starting on upbeats and ending on upbeats. That's kind of medium specific. I could make it even a little bit more general and just say, I want to focus on syncopation. So now I'm focusing my attention on syncopation. Or what's really useful, especially if you're first starting out with these parameters, is to actually go the opposite direction. I can make it even more specific to start, because then there's even less thinking involved. And you can really dig in. So, I'll do the same 4 to 8 bars or so, and I'm going to even be more specific. I'm going to start everything on the end of 2 and end it on the end of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it forces you into even smaller, simpler rhythmic phrases. So I'm just thinking starting every little micro phrase on the end of 2 and ending it on the end of 4.
Awesome.
So there's a lot of wiggle room for more specificity or less, depending on what your needs are and your goals are.
That's super awesome, and that's amazing. Okay, so category 1 for parameters, creating parameters, is rhythm and time. So that's amazing stuff already. What about, let's move on to category 2. What's category 2?
Well, for me, category 2 is what I think of as being kind of the marriage of harmony and melody, right? Because they go hand in hand, right?
Right. Yes.
Every melody implies some sort of harmonic foundation, and when there's a harmonic foundation, what we're doing as improvisers is we're improvising a melody, basically, right? So with this one, it's the same idea. My goal is to get my creative juices flowing and break out of my my habits, and break away from just kind of playing really standard lines, jazz lines. So how do I do that? Well, I can give myself all sorts of restrictions about what part of the chord I'm going to play, if I'm thinking more harmonically, or my harmonic approach to the tune. For example, there's an article I wrote a while back on taking the melodic minor scale and really just going hog wild and maximizing, how many places can I cram the melodic minor scale into the form of Stella by Starlight. So
Yes.
I'll practice. So there's a harmonic angle, a harmonic parameter.
We're gonna link that up in the show notes today. By the way, for those listening, we'll have that in the show notes for anybody who wants to check that out. Go ahead. Sorry.
No problem. Well, also harmonically, or for example, I can think about some part of the chord. So a basic example that you and I have both already talked about a lot, which we don't think of as being a parameter, but it is a parameter exercise, is the idea of guide tones, thirds and sevenths, right? That's a parameter. I'm going to emphasize thirds and sevenths, or you can say I'm only going to play extensions of chords. Or if you need more drilling on the basic jazz harmony, start the opposite way. Start with, I want to hit a root, a third, and a fifth on the downbeat of every bar. So you can look at it from a harmonic angle, or you can look at it from a melodic angle. So there's a lot of options with melodic angles. Again, you and I have both already talked about triads on the site before, which again we can now add into this discussion that that's a parameter. Right, I want to improvise using only major and or minor triads, and you can take that kind of specific idea and make it more general and say, okay, well, you can give yourself creative restrictions with your note choice, with pitch content. So one of a quick example of a fun one I like to do is I'll say I'm only going to allow myself to play 2 or 3 different pitches per chord, and see if I can come up with cool little melodic cells that have some common tones, or maybe not, but basically that still somehow voice lead through the changes. I'm somehow still kind of communicating the changes. So for example, here I'll try to do maybe 4 bars on a concert B flat blues. So I'll take a 3-note little cell, and I'll try and allow myself to only play only three pitches at a time per chord. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So hopefully listeners can hear the form of the blues, right? So I'm still hopefully voice leading enough.
I heard it.
But really only playing 3 pitches for every measure, for every chord change. And again, it just automatically forces you out of all of your normal habits that we sometimes get stuck in as an improviser, and forces you into a paradigm shift where you're thinking in a totally different way, and you just surprise yourself with what you come up with. And again, it just really lends itself to motivic development and to helping you focus on the larger form, which would bring me to category 3.
Awesome. Category 3.
So we talked about, rhythm is category number 1 for parameters. Melody, harmony for number 2. Number 3 is what I would generically call more conceptual restrictions. And so I would put form in that category, where you're thinking about, the overall arc or the overall structure of your solo. How do you want the energy to progress? So you can give yourself parameters that way. One example is, I might want to structure my solo. It could be the whole solo, but more often than not, it's just one part of a solo. So let's say I'm going to structure one chorus or half a chorus by setting up a little call and response with myself. I with my students at the university, I call this my Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde face, where I'll do 2 or 4 bars with one kind of vibe, and then just immediately jump to 2 or 4 bars with another kind of vibe. And this sort of brings it all together, because how do you set up a vibe? Well, you have to have some sort of parameter. So it could be rhythmic. So a classic example would be, I might play 2 or 4 bar units where I'm playing swinging eighth notes, and then I'll jump on the next 2 or 4 bars. I'll play only triplet rhythms, and then I'll go back and forth. So it's almost like I'm setting up these 2 dual personalities that are fighting against each other. So I'll do it in 2 bar phrases on a blues. So I'll eighth notes and then triplets. 1, 2, 3, 4. I cheated a couple eighth notes in the last triplet phrase, but it just sets you up in a totally different structural way of thinking about form. Or you can even get bigger picture and say, like, okay, I don't want to have any eighth notes in my line or in my solo at all until, let's say, 16 bars in or a chorus in, or you could do the opposite. Let's say instead of doing the classic solo arc where I start kind of low, medium energy, and then I build to a climax and then just let the energy come down a little bit at the end, kind of like the structure of a good novel. That's classic. I could say, well, what if I just do something totally different? Like, what if I come out guns blazing and just play all my eighth note and 16th lines at the beginning of my solo and then wind it down and then hand the solo over to a bass player when now it's lower energy. That's a strategy I use a lot on gigs. So, those are more conceptual things, but you're still giving yourself a parameter, right? You've got a goal, you've got a game you're playing with yourself, and it gives you a structure, gives you something to strive towards while you're improvising. So I would also add, not just form to think about. You can think about things like timbre. Like you can start your solo with warm, soft, round timbres and get edgier as you go along. Or you can include dynamics. What if I start and I'm just going to play pianissimo for 8 bars, and then on the 9th bar, bam, a forte phrase, and then back down to pianissimo for 7 bars, and then bam, forte. There's no limit to how creative you can get with these parameters. So,
I mean, there's so many different things you could just do with conception. I mean, even combining rhythm and melody and harmony and all that stuff together.
Yeah, the better you get at these, start mixing and matching. Say I'm only going to play 3 notes per bar, and I'm only going to play on upbeats. And I'm going to start my solo pianissimo and be at crescendo to fortissimo by bar 9. But obviously start with fewer elements as you're getting your bearings.
Awesome, man. This has been amazing stuff. I mean, I'm learning a lot. I know everybody in the audience is learning a lot. I'm thinking to myself, hey, I'm gonna like lock in some of these categories and setting parameters the next time I get a chance to practice. So I would say for everybody listening today, this is a great challenge. Pick one or multiple of these parameters and just say, hey, you know what? The next time I practice, whatever it is I'm going to practice, I'm going to set one of these parameters, whether it be rhythmic or melodic and harmonic or conceptual, and I'm going to try practicing some of this stuff. I mean, so just total gold mine of stuff today. So thanks, Josiah, Boornazian. Thanks, Josiah, so much for just laying it down today. Now, I know that you have a book out now, an improvisation book. I want you to talk a little bit about it because I know that there's people listening, and we talked about, having multiple different forms of guidance. And I know that you're someone I would highly suggest everybody check out because you are just an incredible musician and teacher. So talk a little bit about your book.
Speaking of guidance, so I've been fortunate. I've had so many wonderful teachers over the years that I kind of started keeping like a portfolio combined with a journal over many years. And then a couple of years ago, I started to compile almost kind of like everything I've ever learned that is applicable to creative improvisation in a jazz context, but also even beyond jazz. So if you're into avant-garde music, or if you want to improvise a great solo over a pop tune, or improvise in the context of being a composer. And I kind of compiled all of this into one book. And then at the beginning of the book, there's a section that's just for saxophone players where I sum up a lot of the thoughts and insights about saxophone playing and the approach to saxophone playing. So everybody who gets the book gets the whole book. So if you're not a saxophone player, you just will probably skip the first couple chapters. But there's a lot of stuff in there, from foundational theory all the way up to these more complex ideas about form and phrasing and and all of that. So, I break it up into these kind of big categories. I talk about, there's a big section in the book on rhythm and time and conceptualizing rhythm and time and practicing rhythm and time. There's a huge section on melody and harmony, with a big theory supplement section to make sure you've got most of your bases covered with music theory so that you can understand all the exercises that I talk about and their applications. And then I close out with a big discussion of form, and then there's some other fun little supplements. There's just a huge list of artists that I like to listen to, and some other additional materials that are thrown in there. So it's a pretty cool book. I decided to go 100% 21st century. It's a digital ebook only, and I'm decided to self-publish this one. So it's only available through me, through my website, and you won't find it anywhere else. So.
That is awesome. So Josiah gets more than my full endorsement is worth. So definitely, if you are looking for just a big method of creative improvisation, go out and get it. What's it called again? It
is called Creative Improvisation, A Concise Method. And I use the term concise loosely. It's a pretty big book, but the good thing is, there's so much in there that people can just take what they like and come back to the other stuff later if they're not ready for it, or just ignore it if they're not interested in it. Awesome. Where can everybody listening go and find this book right now? It's on the shop page on my website. So just my full name, josiahboornazian.com/shop. And once you're on my website, you can also see, you can read more about me. You can see my little blog where I occasionally post topics of interest, and my mailing list. It's all there. So maybe I can have you throw up the link on the website so people don't have to struggle spelling my name. Absolutely. Yeah, we will have it in the show notes today, his website where you can go find the book. But it's Josiah Boornazian, Josiah, Josiah, and then last name BOORNAZIAN.com. Yes, I know all about those nasty, horrible, confusing last names too. So yes, indeed, we're in the same boat there. We are in the same boat. Hard marketing names. That's all right. All right. Well, hey, Josiah, thank you so much for being on the show, for just laying it down. I really appreciate it, and I know that we're just going to have you back on eventually in the future. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for letting me be a part of the community. It's a real pleasure for me. It's so fulfilling, and it's been a joy. That is all for today's show, folks. I want to thank you so much for listening. Thanks for tuning in, and a big special thanks to our guest, Josiah Boornazian, for laying down pure gold today and just laying down a lot of value. So really appreciate him, josiahboornazian.com. Hey, if you got a lot out of this podcast today, or maybe you've been listening for a while and you really enjoy this show, I always say this, but please leave a rating and a review on iTunes, or if not, on your favorite podcast listening service. That really helps other people find the show. We are trying to get to 200 by the end of the year. I think we can do that. I think that's quite possible. So if you've been listening for a while, you've never left a kind rating and review on iTunes, go for it. Do it right now. Probably takes like 1 minute to do. Pretty fast, actually. It doesn't take up too much of your time and helps us out a lot. So thanks so much for doing that in advance. Hey, we're going to be coming out with another great episode, as always, next week. So don't miss it. I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the LJS podcast, brought to you by LearnJazzStandards.com. Subscribe to the series on iTunes, and don't forget to join our jazz community at LearnJazzStandards.com/newsletter.